We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Beis Amid Beis in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 92b. On the previous Amid, the Gemara brought a Braisa. The Braisa brought the pasuk by Smicha, by the par. That's the par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. And in the Braisa, Rabbi Yehuda said that the par, that requires smicha, but the seirei avodah zarah, that does not require smicha. And Rabbi Shimon said that the par requires smicha bizikenim, by the elders, but the seirei avodas kochavim, that doesn't require smicha bizikenim. It requires smicha by Aaron, by the Kohen. And the Gemara then brought a contradiction from a second Braisa. The second Braisa said chai. The chai refers to the sar hamishtalech, the sar that's sent to Azazel, that requires smicha, but the seirei avodah zarah does not require smicha according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Shimon says chai ton smicha by Aaron. Again, the sar mishtaleach, that requires smicha by Aaron. And the Braisa continues the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, ve'ein seirei avodas kochavim tun and smicha by Aaron. The seirei avodah zarah, that does not require smicha by Aaron. It doesn't require smicha by the Kohen, ela b'zikenim, rather by the elders. And Rashi explains the contradiction. Ve'ein seirei avodas kochavim tun and smicha by Aaron, ela b'zikenim. The seirei avodah zarah requires smicha by the zikenim. Rabbi Shimon, not Rabbi Shimon. The contradiction over here is within Rabbi Shimon. The Hasam Amar Aaron. Over there in the first Braisa, he said that Seirei Avodah Zarah, the smicha is with Aaron, is with the Kohen. V'hachomer b'zikenim, and here he says it's with the zikenim. But the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rav Sheishes says, V'tizbra, is this even logical? Da'ach kamaisa mitartzasi. Do you think that the first Braisa is a correct Braisa? Anyhow, there are problems with that first Braisa. Ha'amar Rabbi Shimon says, Smicha b'bailim bo'inan, that smicha has to be done by the bailim, by the owner of the carbon. And Rashi explains, V'amar smicha b'bailim, u'bailim de seirei avodas kochavim, the owners of seirei avodah zarah, hainu zakenim, that really should be the elders, representatives of the community, v'lo kohanim, and not the kohanim. So anyhow, that Braisa is difficult. And so the Gemara continues and says, Ella rather, Taratzachi, you have to answer as follows. Hapar, it says the bull, par ton smicha ve'ein seirei avodas kochavim tun and smicha divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Again, Rabbi Yehuda says that the par, that requires smicha, that requires leaning upon the animal, but the seirei avodah zarah, the goat by avodah zarah, that does not require smicha according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says hachai, it says hachai, the living goat, that's the sar hamishtalech, chai ton smicha b'yaron. Again, it is the sar hamishtalech that requires smicha by Aaron. Ve'ein seirei avodas kochavim tun and smicha by Aaron, but the seirei avodah zarah, that does not require smicha by Aaron, ela b'zikenim, rather it's with the elders. And so you see again, according to Rabbi Shimon, it is really the elders who do the smicha by seirei avodah zarah. V'hachi kamer le Rabbi Shimon le Rabbi Yehuda, and this is what Rabbi Shimon is saying to Rabbi Yehuda. Seirei avodas kochavim bo smicha, seirei avodah zarah does require smicha. V'shmiya lach de lo bo smicha, and if you heard that there's no requirement of smicha, be Aaron who the shmiya lach, it's about Aaron, it's no smicha by the Kohen, that's what you heard. Umiyuta, and that exclusion, the fact that it's not Aaron, the fact that it's not the Kohen that does that smicha by seirei avodah zarah, mehachayu, that exclusion is from the chai, meaning again, it's only the sar hamishtalech that has smicha by Aaron, but not the seirei avodah zarah. But the Gemara continues and asks for Rabbi Yehuda, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, Lomali lematinu mikra, why do we need psukim to exclude seirei avodah zarah from smicha? Rashi explains, Rabbi Yehuda, Lomali lemuute seirei avodas kochavim mikra miparim and hachai, the Braisas we brought before, they brought exclusions from par, from chai, to say that seirei avodah zarah does not require smicha. But why does Rabbi Yehuda specifically need a pasuk to exclude? The Amar Ravina, but then Ravina said, and we quoted earlier, Gemiri, that there's a tradition, shtei smichos betzibor, that there's only two smichos by communal offerings. And Rashi explains, V'amar Ravina Gemiri be smichos betzibor. Didn't Ravina say that there's a tradition that there are two smichos betzibor, v'sulo, and no more than two? V'kevan damar b'masnisin chutz mipar helam davar shel tzibor v'sar mishtalech. Since we already said that the exceptions are the par helam davar shel tzibor and the sar mishtalech, those are the two cases that get smicha. So hainu be smichos, that's two smichos. V'lo tzarich krolam mutinu bebraisa mikra. We don't need the braisa to bring psukim as exclusions for seirei avodah zarah, because we already have our two exceptions. There should be no more than two. And the Gemara continues and answers to that, Girsa bi'alma. Rashi explains, Girsa Bialma Kolomar, what it means is as follows. Vaday lo tzarech lemutinu tzvei mikrei. Really, we don't need any more exclusions. Elalahachi hadru metinu. The reason why we use a pasuk to exclude, Mishum Girsa Bialma, it's just a way of learning it over. Shetei ragel shtei smichos betzibor. In other words, a way to be accustomed to knowing the halacha that there are two smichos betzibor, v'sulo, and no more than that. Ukray asmachta bialma. The psukim are just an asmachta, it's just a hint to this idea. In Yenacher, another way of understanding Girsa Bialma means Vaday lo tzrichi kroy. The psukim are not needed. Elakach kibla Rabbi Yehuda mei Rava b'loshen zeh. Just Rabbi Yehuda, he received the tradition from his Rebbe with this language. And Rashi continues and explains, Ul Rabbi Shimon, and according to Rabbi Shimon, Afagav demar besirei avodas kochavim l'smicha, even though sirei avodah zara does have smicha, afilu achi like elabei smichos betzibor. Still, even according to Rabbi Shimon, there's only two smichos by communal offerings. To hagamar beis smichos betzibor Rabbi Shimon, the two according to Rabbi Shimon, hainu bebailim v'soar hamishtaleach ein ton smicha bebailim. The two according to Rabbi Shimon are two smichos betzibor from the owners, but the soar hamishtaleach, there the smicha is not from the owner. To bnei Aaron Rabbi Shimon ein mischaprin b'soar hamishtaleach, because the children of Aaron, they don't get the kapara from the soar hamishtaleach. They are not the owners, and so the tradition is still intact according to Rabbi Shimon. Avol Rabbi Yehuda de lo boy smicha bebailim itzrich, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't have that requirement at all of smicha bebailim, so that's why it's necessary again to teach the two smichas in this fashion. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon seirei avodas kochavim de boy smicha minol, and according to Rabbi Shimon, the fact that seirei avodah zara requires smicha, where does he know that from? And Rashi explains, Rabbi Shimon, the pshita lei de sirei avodas kochavim tunin smicha bezikenim minolon. It's obvious to him that sirei avodah zara requires smicha by the elders. From where does he know that? And the Gemara continues and answers, Nafkalon midatanya, he learns it from the following brisa. V'samach yado al rosh hasar, it says that he's going to do smicha al rosh hasar, on the head of the goat. L'rabos seir nachshon l'smicha divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says this includes the sar that was brought by Nachshon, that's Nachshon ben Aminadav. And Rabbi Shimon Omer, l'rabos seirei avodas kochavim l'smicha. Rabbi Shimon says it's to include the seirei avodah zara for smicha. This is the source. Shahaya Rabbi Shimon Omer, because Rabbi Shimon would say, Kol chatas shenichnas dama lifnim, any chatas where the blood enters inside the mikdash ta'una smicha, that requires smicha. And Rashi explains, Nafkalei midatanya v'samach yado, it says v'samach yado dechsib b'seir nasi. This is what it says by the seir of the nasi, the sar of the king. L'rabo sar nachshon l'smicha, that includes the sar that was brought by Nachshon. Sharei hunami sar nasi, that also is a goat brought by a nasi. V'kashalach tetnan kol karbonos hayachid tunin smicha v'hainami karban yachidu. Maybe you'll say, well, this is an individual's carbon. V'lam l'ikra, why do we even need a pasuk? We know that the karban yachid requires smicha. Afilu hachi yitzrich kral rebuy l'smicha d'sham midoros le'yafin, and you still do need a pasuk here, because this is just something that happened at one point in time when Nachshon and the Nesiim were bringing the karbanos. You wouldn't learn something that happened one time from something that is for all generations. Rabbi Shimon Amar l'Rabo Sirei Avodas Kochavim. Rabbi Shimon says that the pasuk is including Sirei Avodah Zara. Sheinami Soyer l'smicha. That's also a goat where there is smicha. Shahaya Rabbi Shimon Omer, because Rabbi Shimon would say, if the blood is brought inside, then smicha is required. Usirei Avodas Kochavim nami nichnas domon lifnim. By Sirei Avodah Zara also, the blood enters inside. Lafuke Sir Nachshon de'ein domon nichnas lifnim. That's different. That excludes the Sir Nachshon when the blood does not enter inside the Beis HaMikdash. But the Gemara continues and asks, Lamali Lameimra Shahaya, why does the Bryce have to say Shahaya, where the Bryce says Shahaya Rabbi Shimon Omer, that Rabbi Shimon would say any chatos where the dam enters into the mikdash requires smicha? Why say that? And Rashi Ksaviat explains, Lamali Lameimra Shahaya Kavan Damar Sirei Avodah Zara ton smicha. Since Rabbi Shimon already says the Sirei Avodah Zara requires smicha. Memelo Yadana Dechol Chatos Shenichnas Dama Lefnim Tuna Smicha. So I know automatically that any chatos where the blood enters inside requires smicha. To have a parallel davar komish by the param dover, it's written the boy smicha. That's already written in the pasuk that it needs smicha. In terms of the seir hanasa b'fnim on Yom Kippur, that also the blood goes into the mikdash, but that we can't be including with this line in the brisa to asa l'rebuya kedem afarshla. That we're going to say that it's not going to be included, as we're about to say in a moment. And so therefore, again, what is the purpose of this line? And the Gemara continues and answers, Simona bi'alma, it's just a mere mnemonic. And Rashi Ksaviat explains, Simona bi'alma nakte, it's just a mnemonic. Shalo tomar, that you shouldn't say, Seir hanasa b'fnim, that it's the Seir hanasa b'fnim, to hanichnas dama l'fnim, because the blood enters into the Beis HaMikdash. But the Gemara then continues and asks, Ve'emo sir hanasa bifnim. Why don't we say that it's the sar hanasa bifnim that's included for smicha? And the Gemara says to that, no, dumya de sar nasi. What is included has to be something similar to the sar of the nasi. The mechaper al averos mitzvah yadua, because that's an atonement for a known mitzvah, and so therefore we're not going to include the sar hanasa bifnim. Rather, we're going to include seirei avodah zara. And Rashi Ksaviyat explains, Uparich Eimol Rabo Sir Hanasa Bifnim. The Gemara asks, why don't we say to include the Sir Hanasa Bifnim? Because that also again is an example where the blood enters into the Mikdash. Umeshani, and the Gemara then answers, Dum Yolei Kamarbi Dahai Besar Nasi Ksiv. Since this pasuk is written by the Sar Nasi, it has to be similar to the Sar Nasi. The Mechaper Al Averos Sheyesh Ba Yadia. That's a kapara on a known Avera. Shenodelo Hachetz. It's known what the sin is. Aval Sar Hanasa Bifnim Eino Mechaper Al Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. But the Sir inside the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur, that is mechaper on Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav ad sheyodea lo v'yavi olav yored. That's a situation where it is not known, and so therefore again that is not what is going to be included. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ula Ravina, but according to Ravina, to Amar Gemiri Shtei Smichos B'tzibur, he says we have a tradition that there are 2 smichos by communal offerings. So we're really back to the question, Kroi Lamali, what's the purpose of psukim at all? Shouldn't it be obvious just to derive it from the tradition itself? And the Gemara says to that, Itzrich Hilchasa v'Itzrich Kroi, both the Halacha L'Moshe Misina and the psukim, both of them are needed. The Imikra, because if we only had the psukim, Hava Amina Zivche Shalmei Tzibur, one might think that communal shlomim offerings, Kikasha Amasnisin, this was like a question we asked earlier. We asked this question by a Mishnah earlier, Dahach Pirka Dechol Menachos Bos. We asked this in the Parakol Menachos Bos, which the Gemara now quotes. We said earlier, Amar Rav Shimon made a comment and said, Shlosha Minin, there are 3 types that tu'unin shalosh mitzvos, that require 3 mitzvos. The Mishnah over there said that there are 3 cases, and then each of the 3 require 2 of the 3. And so the Gemara on that Mishnah asked, the Leisi b'kal v'chomer, the Gemara asked, why don't we have the following kal v'chomer? V'yehu zivche shal meitzibur tu'unin smicha mikal v'chomer. We should say that communal shlomim offerings require smicha from the following kal v'chomer. That mashal meyochet shein tu'unin tenufa chayim tu'unin smicha chayim. If the individual shlomim, which don't require waving when alive, require smicha when alive, so we should make a kal v'chomer to zivche shal meitzibur. So you might have made that kal v'chomer, and therefore since you might have made that kal v'chomer, that is why it's necessary to have the halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Itzrich hilchasa, the halacha l'Moshe Misinai is needed to say not to make that kal v'chomer. And ve'ime hilchasa, if we only had the halacha l'Moshe Misinai, lo yadin and haininu, we wouldn't know exactly which ones do require smicha. And so kamash malon, that's what it's teaching us with the psukim. Dumya de sar nasi, it should be similar to the sar of the nasi. The mechaper al averos mitzvah yadua, something that's a kapara on a known mitzvah, and therefore we know it's the sirei avodah zara. And of course, again, the par that's already mentioned in the pasuk. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Kol karbanos hayochid tu'unin smicha chutz mi bechor u'maiser u'pesach. All individuals karbanos, they require smicha, except for bechor, maiser, and pesach. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught on a brisa, karbano, it says, is karbon in the pasuk, v'lo ha-bechor, and that comes to exclude the bechor, sheyachol, because one might have thought, v'alo dinu, it's logical, u'ma shlamim shein kedushasan meirechem tunin smicha, if shlamim which are not sanctified from the womb require smicha, bechor shekdushasan meirechem eino din shaton smicha, the bechor which is sanctified from the womb, certainly it should require smicha. Talmud lomar karbano v'lo ha-bechor, so the pasuk says karbano, and that's an exclusion of the bechor. Karbano v'lo meiser, and it says karbano, not meiser. Sheyachol, because one might have thought v'alo dinu, it's logical. Uma shlamim shein mekachin lifneim u'leachareim, if shlamim they don't sanctify before and after them, tu'unin smicha, they require smicha. Meiser shemekadish lefanav u'leachrav, like we mentioned earlier, by meiser it can sanctify before or after the 9th or the 11th animal. So eino din shaton smicha isn't illogical. There should be a need of smicha. Talmud lomar, so the pasuk says karbano v'lo meiser. It says karbano, not meiser, and karbano v'lo pesach. It says karbano and not pesach. Again, sheyachol, one might have thought v'alo dinu, it's logical. Uma shlamim she'eno ba'amud v'havei tu'unin smicha. If shlamim is not something which you have a command, get up and bring this, it requires smicha. Pesach shu ba'amud v'havei, but pesach, which is a requirement right now, there's a requirement at its time to bring the korban pesach. Pesach, Eino Din Shaton Smicha. Isn't it logical it should require Smicha? Talmud Lomar Karbono Velo Pesach. It says Karbono and not Pesach. But the Gemara says Ikal Mifrach, but we can refute this because we can say as follows: Ma'ala Shlamim Shekein Tu'unin Nesachim Utnufas Chazav V'Shok. But Shlamim requires Nesachim libations, and Tenufas Chazav V'Shok it requires the waving of the breast and the thigh, and so therefore these Kal V'Chomers don't even work. Why do we even need the exclusions? And the Gemara says to this, Kroy Asmachta B'Alma, really the Psukim are not needed, and they're just Asmachta, just to hint to this idea. And so the Gemara continues, Ella, well, and if that's the case, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Gimel Amud Aleph.